Hello, my name is Irene Ricks, Director of Diversity Life Sciences for Keystone Symposia. It's a pleasure to moderate this panel discussion for Keystone Symposia and to welcome all of you who are taking time out of your busy schedules to participate. As many of you already know, Keystone Symposia convenes some of the leading life science conferences worldwide. This virtual Keystone Symposia e-panel event is part of an initiative to bring more science to more people. For this e-panel, we will first show a previously recorded roundtable discussion. At the conclusion of that video, the panelists and I will come back live to continue the discussion and answer questions provided online by the global scientific audience. At this time, I would like to introduce the panel. Dr. Lovell Jones, Executive Director of Health Disparities, Education, Awareness, Research and Training, or what is commonly known as HDEART Consortium. Dr. Russell DeBose Boyd, Professor, University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. Dr. Amanda Marie James, Assistant Director of the IMSD Program, Research Associate and Instructor, Emory University, Laney Graduate School and School of Medicine. Glenn Simmons Jr., Assistant Professor, University of Minnesota Medical School, Duluth. Thank you. We will now show the roundtable discussion video, and we will see you back here for the live Q&A. Dr. Jones will not be part of the recorded discussion, but rest assured that we will be able to get his unique perspective during what I expect to be a lively Q&A discussion after the recording. So tune in for that. I'd also like to remind you that during the video roundtable and the Q&A that follows, you can still submit your questions online using the chat feature and Twitter hashtag VKS Disparities. We can't promise to get to all the questions, of course, but we will do our very best. Thank you. Welcome to Keystone Symposia's conversation on health disparities and health disparities research. I'd like to start with you, Russell. What are health disparities, and what do we mean by health disparities research?
Well, to me, as a basic scientist, I believe that health disparities is usually a disease or disorder that adversely or disproportionately affects those of a certain population. And what we mean by research into what are the, in many cases, genetic factors or the socioeconomic factors that can lead to these differences amongst a particular group of individuals.
Okay, so Amanda, in terms of health disparities, in terms of disease pathology, what are we talking about? What kinds of diseases?
So we're looking at anything that affects you based on your socioeconomic status, your lifestyle, or your genetic background. And things like HIV, cardiovascular disease, mental health, which gets looked over very often, and almost every single cancer is definitely part of that list.
So in terms of the types of research activities that are underway, Glenn, can you share with us some research that's going on in terms of health disparities?
I mean, now here is the issue, because as a basic scientist, I think health disparities always gets kind of a bad rap. So let's start there. But some of the work that's being done, basically, we start with all of the cancers, and particularly the cancers that affect African Americans and other minority populations in the U.S., like breast cancer, prostate cancer, renal cancers, specific forms of renal cancer. And the research usually has to hinge upon, getting a hold of those populations of people, which is in fact the hardest part about doing health disparities research, at least at the basic science level. And so there are very few places around the country that are able to even do that well. And so the ones that are doing it, I think they're doing a great job. But I think in order for it to be effective, more institutions, more healthcare organizations have to be involved at that in order to really push some of those agendas forward towards understanding what health disparities really are and how to remedy them.
So why is it difficult to find these populations? I'm sorry.
Now that's
They're there. The populations are there. I think because of the history of medicine here in the United States, it makes it hard to pull from certain populations. So when Glenn was talking about these different pockets of universities that have these really good health disparity centers, the problem is they can't bring their research to the rest of the nation because health disparities affects the population you're sitting in at that moment, because the environment has to do with it. Intergenerational people have to do with it. What's available, the green space even in the community, the food, I mean, the quality of air, everything goes into that. So the research done in Birmingham can't be moved over to somewhere in Los Angeles. Like, it just can't translate the same way. You have to study in the people who you're going to be treating.
Absolutely.
And I really believe that from being a basic scientist, what really makes things go fast is when the basic scientists get interested in it.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's another issue, is that there are places that do have some really exciting, really interesting observations, but it's getting that to the population, to the other, to the basic science population, and convincing them this is really interesting.
Right.
I think that's an issue, and maybe some of this lagging behind.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
So the challenge is that the general population, especially when you're looking at minority groups, don't buy into the understanding of where science is in relation to their community.
Right.
So do you see incidents like what went on many years ago now, decades ago, Tuskegee, impacting on the way especially African Americans sort of relate to the medical community, the clinical studies?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, when we think about situations like what happened at Tuskegee, or in Tuskegee, there are a number of layers of complication that we have to address, because when it comes to medical research, a big trust factor is the linchpin of all of that. And that trust is already compromised because minority populations in the U.S. have a number of things that they have to go through on a daily basis that it's really hard to explain to anyone who hasn't had that experience.
Right.
It's like trying to explain how to climb a tree to a fish. You know, it's just it's
That's
over
difficult.
their head.
Oh, okay.
And so what we deal with today, I think, is a direct effect of that. But the other aspect of that is that a lot of people now have no idea about that. But I think it's the legacy of policies that have come after that that are really, a big issue to deal with.
But I don't think it stops with African Americans. Native Americans, for individuals, were put on a property and told this is where you can stay. Don't come back into our society. Don't integrate yourself back in. So now we're like, let's go study you. And they're like, you didn't want us.
Right.
Or people, immigrants coming over here when they weren't allowed to go to doctors, only allowed to go to certain places. Now we're like, come into our establishment.
Now we want you. Now we want you. Yes.
We're going to pay you. And that doesn't seem all that right, because we pay for clinical trials. And it's just this trust that's like so deep rooted that unless you bring healthcare workers and basic scientists that look like the people who are going to be the ones and being investigated, that I don't think it will ever move.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't forget the education.
Right.
Yeah. I believe that's the other thing, that not just for underrepresented minorities or certain populations, but for everybody.
Yeah, that's
to
right.
understand science and to understand that it's not, it's not the mad scientist, the evil mad scientist in his lab. It's really, we're doing something to try to benefit everyone, right? And I believe that that's another.
Well, that's the major. I think you hit the nail on the head, because a lot of times we blame the uneducated lay persons, and the reality is that it's the very educated people that are the biggest barrier. Particularly when you have a basic scientist that says, I have this very interesting mechanism that I think is going to be correlated to this disease. One, I have to ask this person over here, can I get money for it? Two, I have to ask a clinician to help me to get more patients involved so that we can make some kind of headway in understanding this disease.
Right.
Well, if the clinician doesn't care, and if the person that has the money doesn't care, then the scientist is kind of left, I can't do the work.
Right, I'll just study whatever group they're going to give me money to study.
And there you have it.
And then we're back to the same place, because I'm not going to study a disease or study a population that doesn't affect the people I sit with every day. It's really hard. Like, that's human nature. So if I'm the money maker and I'm the clinician, why would I study this population that I only come in contact with once a year?
Right.
But what about the big name diseases like HIV? You mentioned HIV. Cardiovascular. We all have hearts. We all have lungs.
Yes, absolutely.
So why hasn't there been a bigger, inroad into making sure that those kinds of disparities get addressed first?
Because they have actually. The numbers in the Caucasian and white community have gone down.
Oh,
Absolutely.
okay.
I mean, we are calling them behavioral changes, and those behavioral changes that different populations can do based on the studies that have been done, we know that
Okay.
the disease is, I'm not saying they're gone, by no means.
Right.
And there are just still a lot of layers to it,
Yeah.
but they're seeing the trend they want.
Absolutely.
Okay.
When the
So they're
trends are-
diminishing.
right.
Okay.
And I think that an issue behind that is because a lot of the large studies
Studies are done only in a certain
are
population.
done only in a
Okay.
certain population.
There
you go. So
there,
when you get that
there are
result.
very few studies in which there was a large minority population, and one study that really was beneficial, that actually has a new drug on market that's really great.
Right.
It was actually an African American that
Right.
it was really kind of discovered in a way.
And what was that?
This was this PCSK9.
Yep.
Yep.
It's a new cholesterol lowering
Oh,
drug.
okay,
and it was
right,
actually
right.
an African American female who had a null mutation, and it was really a great finding.
Right.
And that really kind of led the way towards development of this new drug.
And it's actually kind of funny because the few drugs that have been approved using a good mixture of populations have stayed on the market. A lot of them that were
Right.
done in just one single population, like we didn't start bringing females into the
I
conversation.
was just getting ready to say
until,
sex
the last
differences.
Exactly.
Yes,
Right.
it's
Yeah,
sex
right.
difference
So, like, sex
research.
difference is just
Yes.
like-
But basic scientists every day know that, wait, I can't have just these, gender of mice or these gender of mice because it will skew my data
Right,
one way or the
exactly.
other.
Right.
So we know that.
We already know
But
that.
why weren't they doing that?
Right.
I know it costs more money to have female and male mice
So
models.
for
but
at least in the genetic research I do, our biggest issue was what does estrogen do? We can't even bother with estrogen. We can't be bothered with it. And so we're just going to take estrogen out of the
We just
picture,
remove it from the
remove it from the
equation.
picture,
Exactly.
and our
pray that it
number
doesn't come
right,
back.
and pray it never comes back, and it doesn't cause any problems.
Oh,
So
my.
like it was,
Yeah.
some of it was, I'm not even going to say laziness, but like not understanding it had to be an integrated system. It was more
Yes.
complex than we wanted it to be.
Yeah, and I think that is the nature of a lot of, I don't want to say the nature of science, but it's the
Yeah.
nature of research.
Yeah.
Is that
Yes.
we are reductionists by
Yes.
our skill
Absolutely.
set.
Yes,
We
yes.
simplify everything and then we throw it back into the complicated system and say,
Yeah.
now let's watch it work.
Right.
And the thing is that I think a lot of the funding and a lot of the conversations we're having now, systems biology, quantitative biology, we understand that everything is connected. So we need more and more computer power, more and more data sets in order to understand how things are really working.
Right.
And health disparities actually is right in line with that
Yes.
thinking. If people would
Right.
understand is that if we bring everybody to the table biologically, genetically,
and don't leave out the behavioral scientists.
and
yeah.
Oh,
we
yeah.
can't we can't do that.
Right.
We can't do that.
Right.
But again, that's kind of like estrogen. It's like,
Right.
wait, that's really complicated. We don't want to
We
touch
don't-
that yet.
We trying to
But
figure
no,
what's happening.
but it's absolutely true because
Yes.
a lot of the health disparities sometimes do have a behavioral component,
Yes.
and that's
Almost all.
behavioral due to culture, due to traumatic events.
Yep.
It's a number of other things that are put into there, and then
Right.
and if we want to throw in another a little squirrel into the mix, then we throw in epigenetics as opposed to talking about genetics.
Yeah.
Let's talk about epigenetics,
Epigenetics.
Yes.
which responds to the environment
Yes.
that you're in,
Yes.
which can affect your behavior.
Yep.
Yes.
So it's not as clean cut as some people would like to believe.
Right.
And I think one of the major things that we're understanding is that the newer generations of scientists that are coming in are facing that reality. Whereas scientists from, yesteryear, not saying they're, not good scientists or anything like that, but to saying that they don't have to deal with the complicated systems that
Yes,
we
we
have
have
to
to-
deal
yeah.
with.
Right.
My first R01 grant is going to have to hit a
hit
lot
all of- right.
of those points or I won't get funded. That's just the reality.
Right.
So
When they could write about a cell system
right. It's
25 years ago.
It's like I
and-
have this one pathway. That's all I'm
Yes.
going to do.
and they don't have to take the other things into account. There's actually a group out of San Francisco that did a study with Asian Americans that came over, and depending if when they came over here to the United States, the epigenetics changed.
Yes.
So their ability
Yes.
to
Based
get
on-
obesity.
Yes, obesity.
I know that
Was-
one.
yes,
It was,
I know that.
I mean,
That's
the numbers were just so
Yeah.
crazy.
Yes, it's
living on the
amazing.
same food,
Right.
just living in a different part
It's
of
like
the world.
flipping a switch.
Yes.
It's like
Yes,
flipping a
something
switch.
happened to their body.
Right.
And the fact that we're not taking that into consideration when we're treating them as the clinicians and when we're
Absolutely.
doing our research on them as a
Absolutely.
basic scientist,
Absolutely.
we're missing it. We're missing something.
Yeah.
And we're not even talking about it.
Well, and I think one other issue too that we have is nowadays things are there are many we have many more tools than we used to have. We have many more ways we can address questions. And I believe one thing that you can start to see changing is that not one person or one group of people can answer all the questions.
Right.
You know, I mean,
Right.
it's just impossible.
Right.
You know, especially when you get epigenetics involved. You get so I really think it takes a community of people that maybe some behavioral scientists, maybe some geneticists, those with
Right.
epigenetics, some genetics. I think and some basic science. So all these people have to focus on their area of expertise, but apply that to
To a single question.
one simple question, or
Yeah.
one disease, one disorder.
Yeah.
I believe
Right.
that's really how it has to move forward, because there's so many things that change, and if you really think about it, small changes in multiple things can have a large phenotype.
Right.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
the 1%
definitely.
rule.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Change one thing by 1%.
Yeah.
And I really
Definitely.
believe that's where it takes, you have to dive down and stay focused. And I think that's something that some of our mentors taught us as far as being very, very focused.
Right.
But now we got to think outside the box and not be. You can be focused, but you also need to talk to people.
Right.
around you.
Yes.
Right, but you can
And I
do
think
both
that's
as
how
a
you
basic
can.
scientist,
Yes.
and I think that's where
Yes.
at least being
training has to be.
the
It's
training
not either or.
Yeah, the training needs to
Right.
be there. You need to understand, so I'm a pharmacologist with translational research experience. Who do I need to sit at the table with? I shouldn't sit at the table all of the pharmacologists. That just doesn't work.
Right.
But isn't that the way science is going now? It's sort of a team approach.
Absolutely.
Where you have
Absolutely.
to bring
I
in.
think so.
Even a lot of the training grants that are being put together by universities are now saying, well, what are you doing to help them understand team science?
Yes, bioinformatics.
We won't fund your T32. We won't fund your IMSD unless you're teaching them how to work in groups.
teams. That's
have
right.
to.
Right.
Yeah.
It's very important. So speaking of that, and when you talk about funding, what do you think the federal government is doing, or can be doing, or should be doing to sort of advance this agenda? We do have the National Institutes of Health, where they have an institute dedicated specifically to minority health and health disparities. What would you like to see from them? What would you like to see from others in the federal government, that space where a lot of the funding happens?
Can I raise my hand?
Absolutely.
And I just want to lead this also. I'm going to set it up like a T-ball stage, because I love the fact that there's a specific institute, but I feel like there's just not enough basic science coming out of the institute. So when we look at, and I love those individuals who are doing a lot of the sociological, biobehavioral work, but if the basic science isn't involved, then we know that it kind of stays in a silo, and it goes into a certain set of journals. It never gets to the basic scientists, and it seldom gets to the clinicians. So if we could see how we could push more of that, I think that would be a great starting place.
Okay.
Well, I think I completely agree. But I think that's where the issue lies. So in many cases, it's a geneticist that's going to study these certain families and find a certain, or maybe a certain trait that can be heritable.
Right.
How do you get the basic scientist to get interested in that problem? And I really, it really boils down to money. It really does, because
Always.
it's going to be, it's tough, because as a geneticist may not have the skill set to go through and do the basic scientist to know, the exact, like I said earlier, about someone being focused on a certain problem. That's what it takes to actually get out, the molecular mechanism by which, a certain gene contributes to a certain disease. And I think that's where it takes this team approach. But I think, how are you going to get that other team, how are you going to get them involved?
Right.
And how are you going to get them funded for it? And I think that's really a tough problem.
And the funding, unfortunately, anyone who braves the funding mechanisms that are available today, you will find the harsh reality that if you do anything that specifically looks at health disparities from a basic science standpoint, you will have the hardest time getting funded.
Yep.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the reality is, as Amanda stated earlier just now, we know that we have an intrinsic ability, or just habit, of focusing on things that we can relate to.
Yep.
So if I am from a particular background, then I'm going to be focused on things that relate to people and events from that background. So as an African American basic scientist, I want to study things that affect African Americans. That's just my thing.
That's normal.
Right.
That's,
But if I, as an African American scientist, write an R01 grant that has a focus on health disparities, that looks at minorities and particularly African Americans, the funding, the likelihood of funding goes down precipitously.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
that stops basic scientists from wanting to
Yes.
get into the game.
Well, I also think, so I think there was a moment when we were doing it as scientists. And the problem is that we allow people from the clinical point of view to identify themselves racially and ethnically. So our numbers weren't coming out well. We were doing studies looking at the genetic difference in this polymorphism in cardiovascular disease, and nothing was showing up. It'd be like only one little portion of the whole population, because you're allowing someone to identify themselves. And so here in the United States, ethnic and racial descent is self-identified. We didn't do a genetic test on them first. So, and there's
So
other
how would that
populations-
make a difference in terms of funding?
in terms of, because if you were funded for the first cycle and you publish some stuff and your findings aren't that great, are you going to get funded again? No. Any research that's related to it's going to get funded? No.
Yeah. Well,
And compared to like Tay-Sachs disease, that is
Yeah.
a small population. Everyone
Yeah.
knows their background. They can
Right.
show the genetic link.
Yeah.
Therefore, then now they can do more things with it.
well, I think the issue, so we have racial and we have ethnic.
Oh yeah.
And if you go you go to
Yeah.
like the old school like conservation biology standpoint of all of this stuff, like stepping it all the way back, we use race to define something genetically, and
Yeah.
unfortunately race and genetics don't mix.
Yes,
It
not at
doesn't
all.
mix.
They're not even the
Now
same thing.
ethnicity maybe a little closer, but it probably would be better for us to use a term like ecotype. Basically, wherever you are from historically,
Historically,
geographically, there may be a chance that you will have a certain genetic profile.
Yes.
But the genetics aren't necessarily strong in favor of that, not compared to like, say, species like chimpanzee.
Right.
Like you can actually look at them and say, this is a subspecies. Here are a panel of 25% or more genes that are different in these guys versus these guys.
Yes.
Humans don't have that.
Nope.
We've mixed way too much, even with our ecotypes, like Africans, people of African descent, people of European descent. Yes, very different in a lot of ways. But on the genetic level,
Yep.
it's relatively small. So
Very
race
small.
isn't easy. But again, we come back to things like epigenetics. We
Yes.
come back to things like hereditary trauma, where there are
Right.
things that happen to people in their environment over their history on this planet that will change how certain alleles are expressed.
Yes.
So you may have the genetics, the genes are there, but is it expressed as a protein?
Yeah.
We don't know. We don't have a proteome for
Yeah,
every
no.
person yet. And again, when we even talk genetics, what population represents the majority of what went into the Human Genome Project?
Right.
So we don't.
And then we're not talking
Well,
like
we're
you
not
said,
representing that.
What about the case, and I know I shared that with you, with all the fellows in one of the updates on, there's a tribe or a group, there's a community
Yes.
on an island, and they have the marker for Alzheimer's to the degree
Yeah.
that it is almost
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
every single
Everybody, yeah.
family
Yeah, it's gonna
member.
happen.
Yeah.
So what about cases like that, beyond that? There are other cases. There's Huntington's disease that's also expressed on, it's in a particular community.
Yeah. Yeah. Tay-Sachs,
So what do you think of that in terms of, are there ways that we can extrapolate and think about how we can, because it sounds like it's almost too difficult a prospect, the way you're posing it. And I understand that, but I want to know that there is some hope that
I
we
think
can.
we're thinking about it too simplistically, though. I
Yes.
think that's been
Okay.
the problem.
That's the first issue.
Yeah, I think that we're like, oh, if we can just tell who's black and who's white and then study blacks and whites,
Right.
we'll figure out all the problem difference.
Right.
No.
It's like, no.
So, like, the fact that there's within blacks, within whites, we're not even including every other race
Right.
that's even in there, because a lot of times you just say black and white. Like,
Right,
that's the only two
right.
kind of people in the world.
Right.
So we're forgetting populations in there, and then the mixing of populations,
Yes.
and then what Glenn said about protein expression. So you genetically might have something, but you're not expressing the protein correctly. It's been mutated for whatever reason. So like that's why the basic scientists need to be the fundamental portion of this whole entire thing.
And I do think that one thing that we may take a step back and just go back to simply do some types of trials in a different population. So for example, instead of looking at something as a very complex phenotype, look at something very simple that can be measurable. So I work with cholesterol, I work on cardiovascular disease. Well, let's look at extremes of cholesterol levels, of plasma cholesterol
Mm-hmm.
levels that's not novel, but looking at in a certain population would be,
Right.
Because again, most of these are not in underrepresented groups.
Right.
And, I think that's where there's a wealth of information.
Yeah.
Yes.
In some cases, we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah. No,
I think we can still apply some of the things that have already been done.
Exactly.
Just do it to a different
Exactly.
population. And I think that may get things rolling, because
Yes.
if you think about it, if you get one, yes, there's a lot of disorders that may be multigenetic, but if you get one that is monogenetic, and that just kind of gets things rolling,
Right.
And kind of you got to start somewhere.
Right.
I really
Yes.
believe that's where an institute can really help out. Is maybe taking these and putting resources there to do something that's already been established, but do it in a different population.
Yeah.
So do you see Keystone having an impact on NIMHD?
Absolutely.
In the opposite way? So instead of saying, well, perhaps what they're doing is not in terms of relating to basic science applicable, you can say to them, you can work with them in a policy structure. And that gets back to policy.
Yeah.
In terms of what do you think government policy should be related to health disparities?
Well, I think, what Russell just hit on right there is that in order to get someone to invest their life working on something, I mean, all of us who've done our postdocs know, it's like, wait, I don't spend that much time at home. So if I'm going to spend time on it, I need to know that there's somebody within this mechanism that has my back. Because we step out on a limb as scientists to say, I'm going to work on something and I don't have the answer, but I need to know that you're not going to pull the rug from under me.
Right.
And especially when you're working on something as a minority scientist. So if the go-to funding agency, the go-to institute, has a mechanism for you to do that. I mean, it's kind of like these pioneer awards, but we're thinking really small.
Right.
It's like, give me a pilot funding mechanism. If I get it and I provide some data, some hard data, well, then I'll go somewhere else. I don't need to stay in that mechanism. That would be an ideal type of thing.
And I think what they need to think about it is, so we have this clinical trial that worked really, really well, but it was done majority 80% in African Americans or 80% in Caucasians. Let's move it to the opposite population. Let's move it to another part of the country and do the exact same thing.
So we don't spend all that money on clinical trials and then get drugs that don't work.
Well, I think that Keystone would be, and it's set up for this, is to bring some of these issues to the basic scientist.
Yes.
Because I believe that a lot of times that's where things may get bogged down. Someone may have a population that may, things may be there, but again, we need that team. And you have to be able to get a basic scientist's attention, or get a junior faculty member that's just starting his or her lab. You have to get their attention. I think that's where Keystone can really help out a lot, is to maybe bring attention to some of these issues, to maybe even bring the person running this health disparity project to the basic scientists. And say, look at what we're doing, and I think that would almost help a lot.
Okay. Well, one of the things that we're doing with the fellows is we've created 2 health disparities working groups, one on cancer and one on genetics genomics. And so Glenn has joined the genetics genomics group. And so one of the things that initially we thought we would do was have a health disparities conference, and look at a lot of different types of issues, including bioethics. But they decided to instead do 2 different workshops attached to 2 different Keystone major conferences.
That's a good idea.
I think it's a good idea.
And that's the direction we've gone in. We've actually gotten funding support from NIMHD for the cancer health disparities workshop.
I think the only issue, and I'm not even saying the issue to any of that's amazing, and that's why I jumped on. I was like, can I get on that? But the issue is that the prevailing zeitgeist behind health disparities is that it is a socioeconomic problem exclusively, and that when people try to connect genetics to it, it doesn't match up neatly enough for them to say that it is in fact the case. But there are enough studies out there to contradict that, and to say that no, there's something there. We just don't know how to look at it yet. Just the same as if you think about germ theory. When Louis Pasteur finally was able to say, hey, look, I was able to do this. I think we're in that same kind of space, and that genomics and genetics are definitely a thing we have to acknowledge, and maybe even throw in epigenetics as well. Because I've read numerous papers. Now, some of them have been kind of shot down by, again, the the overarching power structure of science. You know,
Yeah.
the people who've already made it and feel like nobody else should. You might edit that out. But the idea that again, hereditary trauma being an epigenetic mechanism whereas certain epigenetic marks are maintained, and that's epigenetics is heritable changes that have nothing to do with the DNA sequence.
Right.
And people say, oh, no, there's no way hereditary trauma can exist. But if epigenetics exists as we've defined it classically, then hereditary trauma is a viable mechanism for things to be transmitted.
Right.
Which therefore, it means that genetics may not be the answer, but genetics are the template on which epigenetics lay.
That's true.
So if you have the gene and it's not expressed, or it's expressed in some type of deviant fashion, we need to look at that. So it would be great to get funding for the genomic side at some point for the working group.
Oh, yeah,
But to go on that, so you're talking about those powers to be, I keep going back to personalized medicine, because that's really where this answer needs to come. Like, or in the end, this is where we're going to end up being at. And if we can sell the idea to big pharma, to the powers to be, that if you help us now on this end, you'll get to do personalized medicine. That means every single person you get to do something different, which means you can charge them different things.
It's like you have a lot more going on with your genome.
Right. You'll be able to make a lot of money if you put some money in right now.
But could that be another form of exploitation? Let's say you have a population that is undereducated in this field, and you come to them with solutions to their health problems that they haven't even identified, don't even know exist.
Oh, definitely.
Can there be an element of exploitation?
Oh, that's where the bioethics should have to come in.
The policy has to keep up with that. It has to keep
and
up.
that's where a lot of our science problems come from, at least bioethically, is that our science and our policies aren't keeping up.
Right, science is moving faster than
then the
everything
policies
else.
are.
I mean, even the idea of us having the Human Genome Project completed, it's like, wait a second, now that we have this, what can we do?
Exactly.
I mean, and we're in the same dilemma now with CRISPR and gene editing.
Yes.
You know, it's a great mechanism in theory for personalized medicine.
Right.
But wait, should you do it?
Right. Exactly.
We don't know yet.
But if we're trying to talk to the big power people, the people who have the money,
it has to benefit them.
we have to show them where the money.
A tangible benefit.
Yeah,
absolutely.
we can show you this will make you money.
Yeah.
Now, hopefully, as science policy can keep up with it, Keystone can help with that too. That's definitely a place Keystone could be advocating for. The policy stays up to date.
And along
in
with,
what way? What would Keystone specifically do?
When Capitol Hill Days, things like that, when they're making these policies of how the government can regulate these things, that's where Keystone can come in. They can go to those Capitol Hill Days and make sure that an actual scientist is explaining the work to them, not someone
That's interesting. We actually don't have that mechanism.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, I don't think we have that
Keystone
yet.
doesn't have a legislative office like the societies.
Right.
So we don't have a Hill Day where our scientists go up on the Hill. It's something that I've thought about because I used to work with Kevin Wilson at ASCB. I ran the minorities portfolio. He ran the public policy portfolio. So I would go with him on the Hill, especially if there were minority scientists that wanted to go. But we don't have that here at Keystone. So maybe some of the fellows at some point, or some of the SAB members, I don't know. That's something to think about.
So what about an idea of, again, like I am so remiss that the idea of health disparities has almost been completely owned by the public health side of things. Not that they aren't doing an awesome job. It's just that, but the basic science isn't able to keep up because our focus is on where our money is coming from.
Right.
But to have at some special workshops at specific meetings, because it may not be big enough to have an exclusive Keystone meeting, but to bring in the biobehavioral folks and the basic scientists and the policy people into those conversations so that all of that can happen in that space. Because there was a big meeting down in Houston, and I know for a fact it was very few basic scientists there, comparatively.
No, that's true. Are you talking about the one that Lovell Jones?
Right, exactly.
Yes, there were very few basic scientists.
And I had, as a undergrad, I had attended one of the Intercultural Cancer Council meetings way back. And, as an undergraduate scientist, in the lab, I'm there like, okay, great, let's talk science. And it was all very skewed towards the public health side, which I didn't understand then.
Well, I mean, I think as a basic scientist, and I mean, I think there's a disconnect between the basic scientist and someone that may be having interest in health disparity. Let's say for an entire symposium that's on health disparities. I mean, not many basic scientists are going to really find that interesting.
Right.
That's why I really believe that this idea of having workshops
Yes.
at the symposium would be
attached to things.
really good, because
We're
I really
excited.
think that's where we need to bridge it. That's where the gap needs to be bridged.
Like the people will touch each other. They won't, diffuse themselves across the spectrum.
Because as basic scientists, we just think we're too focused. I'm too focused on a certain biological or biochemical reaction.
And that's why, as basic scientists, we take the race out. We take socioeconomic status out. We're we're looking at mice, cells, whatever it may be. Blind the samples to me. I don't need to know what happened. Just, I'm going to give you outcomes, and then we go back. So, part of being a good scientist is the ability to do that.
Right, to try to remove as much of the bias
as possible. Yeah. But at some point, it needs to come back in.
Yeah, it has to
but if you find that, hey, gene X causes African Americans to have, much lower cholesterol levels, that would catch a basic scientist's attention.
Right. Oh, definitely.
Things like that. So that's where you have to bring the two together.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Right.
And I think that's really where, both sides have to communicate.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we're comfortable. Basic scientists are comfortable talking to themselves, and I'm sure people studying health disparities are comfortable talking to themselves. But you need to talk to each other.
Well, what's interesting?
An
interesting thing that I've experienced, because I did my graduate training at a historically black institution, and that was the first time essentially one of my mentors was a behavioral social scientist, and she was extremely, she communicated with everyone well. And it was surprising to me that it was in that space that we were able to really try to ask questions. Now, we may not have produced as much science as we would have liked, for numerous reasons, but we were always at the table together. And I think when it comes to health disparities, whether we're talking a Hispanic serving institution, a historically black serving institution, or anything in between that is not a, R1 level institution that is usually a predominantly white institution, if we're able to get at those places and the funding can just kind of keep up just a little bit, you would see a lot more progress.
Right.
Because we have places like Morehouse Medical College that has done a lot of work with a specific focus on health disparities. Meharry Medical College, and we know that it's largely because the demographic that they're interested in is the demographic that they're from.
Well, like at Howard, they had the sickle cell anemia center.
Exactly.
Right.
But I think that would be great even as clinicians and the basic scientists to think of it. We've done this here in Atlanta. It's worked great in our African American community. How do we bring it to Nashville, Houston? Not even. We don't have to go to another race even yet. Let's just see. Can we bring it to another?
Can we just move it?
Does this still work, or is it more than just the genetics in this area?
Is it the culture of that particular part of the country? Yeah, absolutely. I think and it's a awesome mechanism to do it because, if the president of this university, of this medical institution, of this hospital is in on it, you should be able to theoretically make a phone call to this other president. Now, I may not be able to make the phone call. It's like, oh, you're just a lowly postdoc assistant professor. Or whatever.
Exactly.
You're not
Don't sell yourself short.
well, we just know how it works. We know about the cold emails. It just doesn't get a reply. But if we're able to connect those things, and really just, again, it takes a community, as Russell said. And if we're not able to continue to expand upon our community, then we're never going to fix the problem. We'll have one lab over here do a great job, publish a great paper, and then it'll just go by the wayside.
But that's true even without looking at race and ethnicity. And when you think about HIV, the fight between the U.S. and France, and that whole bitter battle, instead of focusing on what was important,
it's a global
because
problem.
Politics get into it, ego gets into it.
Exactly.
But I think that's where the mechanism of our federal government can come into play. So this group, has done this. We'll give 3 other sites to do the exact same thing in collaboration. Everyone gets X amount of money and do this many people, and let's see where it can go.
But you know what? That's also touching on a whole nother issue in terms of basic science, is the idea of making sure that whatever was already published is legit.
Yeah.
Because reproducibility is a big issue.
But
So
that would move into
that
this.
would fix that.
Right.
It's like we did it 3 other times.
No, these are great ideas, and we're going to get ready to wrap up. So if you were to be given a magical bullet and you had the chance to transform all of this that we've talked about, all of the mechanisms, all of the policies, all of the practices, procedures, and institutions, what would be the one thing that you would want to see happen to help end health disparities in the U.S.? And I'm saying the U.S. because we know this is a global problem, but let's focus at home, in the U.S. Let's start with you, Russell.
If I had a magic wand,
Yes.
I would go like this, and there would be a pile of money for this huge, like, remember the days used to be these glue grants that actually funded multiple mechanisms. You know, you'd have funding for the basic research, you'd have funding for the health disparity, for the genetics, for the social. It was all one big, maybe it's multi-institutional. That's how you bring in HBCUs. That would be my magic wand, because I really believe that's one of the major problems that holds this type of research back. It's just pure money. And so my magic wand would be just an unlimited source of funds for a large, huge network.
Okay, very good.
Mine would be education. But I think it needs to start so much younger. It can't be when a mom who's pregnant at 19 years old is going to the doctors for the first time, didn't really go to doctors as a child, she's not going to bring her kid the right way. Like, it needs to be fundamental. As easy as it is to go to the grocery store, to the mall, it needs to be right there all the time. It needs to be on multiple levels. We need to understand it needs to come in multiple languages. I mean, the fact that we have social media, we're never using it in the right capacity, so let's start using that. Like, educate the people at their level, not to the level that you want them to know it at.
Right.
Good.
Man, this is a tough question. Well, honestly, it would be education. It would be money. It would be education and money. No, my magic bullet would really go to the grassroots. Not so much educating people about what's going on in healthcare and any of that, but education in terms of people really having ownership of their culture, of their lives, of their neighborhoods. Because there's so many models that I go back in history books that, 40, 50 years ago, where a lot of the diseases we see now were essentially relegated to only certain people, period. You had to work hard to get them. Now it seems you fall off a truck and you end up with, cardiovascular disease, HIV. What I think it has to be is that the neighborhoods have to become strong enclaves unto themselves, so that the neighborhood school has a purpose, the neighborhood, the block has a purpose. Blocks don't mean anything anymore.
Right.
But there was a time where if you did something on one end of your block, by the time you got home, you may have gotten disciplined at least twice before you got to your mom.
That's
and
true.
your mom might have took care of you the rest of the way.
That's true.
If you know what I mean. So I think things like that would be essential, because we know that the thing that determines success for a lot of us who've made it through socioeconomic hardship has been the involvement of the parents and the family at the earliest stages, allowing them to have the resilience and the grit to make it all the way to the end.
The resilience,
And
that's
so,
that word.
and so,
Resilience
and if we're not able to really say resilience is our standard,
Right.
then all of this we're talking about is just it's in the ether.
Right.
So if we can do that, the magic bullet, everybody's gonna make it through high school and go on to college. And if you want to do something different than that, that's your choice. And it's not going to be a money issue, and it's not going to be your grades. It's a choice.
Right.
That's my magic bullet. And I'm done. I'm going to drop the mic now.
Well, thank you. I think this has been a very enlightening, very provocative discussion, and I look forward to continuing it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are back live. At this point, we want to continue the discussion with Dr. Lovell Jones and get his perspective on the status of health disparities research in the U.S. After that, we will get to questions submitted to us online.
Thanks, Irene. Looking at health disparities and looking at health disparities today, we've made, I would say, 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. We tend to be moving in the right direction, but when you look at who's involved in health disparities and you look at the funding stream in health disparities, I tend to be an equal opportunity criticizer. And in that, I wonder in terms of who's involved and who's leading the band, how many of them are seriously involved in health disparities for the right reasons and not for the money? I've been at this business probably too long, but I remember sickle cell anemia and the vast amount of money that went towards sickle cell anemia. And what most people don't realize is that a lot of that money went to creating the cancer centers that we have today in terms of hemolytic diseases. And not a lot of it went to sickle cell anemia. It went to addressing blood disorders and blood diseases on the pretense that it would answer some of the questions with regards to sickle cell. And only recently have we started to make advances in sickle cell. For the time that the money was put in, still a few years ago, the treatment for sickle cell anemia had not changed in 25 years. Yet it is the first or one of the first genetically described diseases. So you would expect, as such, to have benefited from the genomic revolution. Yet it did not. And I'm fearful that we will have the same thing happen with health disparities. Unless we really take a hard look at it and realize that health disparities, health inequities impact all of us, not just people of color, not just poor people, but all Americans, that it is an American problem that needs an American solution, and not a solution just for African Americans or a solution for Native Americans or a solution for Asian Americans or any of the people along those lines. And unless we do that, we're going to be here 2 decades later, if we're still here, because the issue of health and the status of health in this country is the Achilles heel of this country in terms of our survivability. Right now, we spend more on healthcare than any other nation in this world. And we're right at the crucible of the tipping point where we will become a debtor nation if we allow this to continue. And given the political climate, I think we're looking over that edge more quickly than I had imagined 2 or 3 years ago. And it seriously scares me. The other issue is that we're siloed. We still remain siloed in that we have genomicists looking at health disparities, and we have social scientists looking at health disparities, and we have community activists looking at health disparities. And it's almost like everybody's looking at the elephant from a different point, trying to describe what the elephant looks like and what is the solution to the elephant's problem. Those who are looking at the trunk think that the trunk is the most important part because that's where the elephant drinks and it feeds itself, and we need to take care of it. From those who are looking at the rear end, it's how the elephant excretes its waste and where it goes that becomes the most important part in how we look at this issue. As opposed to looking at the entire elephant. And for the last 20 plus years, one of my themes has been the idea of looking at this in a holistic or biopsychosocial manner. And for the last 15 years is trying to get genomicists, social scientists, policy people, everyone in the same room to talk about the issue. In fact, I started this with cancer more than 30 years ago, getting everybody in the same room, and decided that it's just not one disease, but it occurs in all diseases and all health issues. And therefore, we need to bring everybody to the table, because a solution to cancer is a solution to diabetes, a solution to hypertension, a solution to a number of diseases that we are impacted with. And then thirdly and lastly, we need to go back to the infectious disease model in terms of healthcare instead of the chronic disease model. The chronic disease model is you have cancer, you have diabetes, that's your problem. It doesn't impact me, yet it does. That $50 box of Kleenex in the hospital that you pay for, or that your insurance pays for, that you ultimately pay for in terms of your insurance policy, is the result of the chronic disease model. For the infectious disease model, I go back to the maid in the master's house that he or she was concerned about that maid because that maid took care of their children, took care of the family, and that maid had to be healthy. Today, we don't care about people. It shows up in the current policies with regards to the cuts proposed for Medicaid and Medicare and all of the other social issues that they think just impact poor people, but ultimately will impact them. Until we get to this point where we realize that you don't have to like somebody to care about their health, because ultimately that health impacts you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Very true statements. We are getting a lot of chatter from the community. Let me share one with you.
Irene, can I make one more comment? I'm always forgetful. I'm getting to that age. Yeah, I want to extend an invitation to all those who are listening to the 15th annual Disparities in Health in America Working Towards Social Justice, which is just that sort of meeting that brings in everybody. And one of the main topics that we're going to cover is mental health and health inequities, which is a topic that's not covered as much, as well as health inequities and the LGBTQ community that we don't talk about, and the issues that impact them. And the theme of this meeting of this year, and probably until we really address the issue, is that public health disparities and inequities make us all sick.
Right.
It's June 19th through the 24th at Rice University. If you want to know more about it, it's www.HDEART Consortium. That's HART with a D silent, consortium.org. Thanks, Irene.
No. Thank you for that. And I'll be there. So I'm looking forward to it. So the first question from our chat room comes from Christy, and she wants you to touch on policies. This is directed to you, Lovell, that were implemented or have been implemented post-Tuskegee that have further contributed to medical mistrust in the minority community.
Well, the problem is that I'm trying to think of Barbara's last name. Yeah, I'm getting old. She's at the University of Michigan, who actually came up with 8 principles with regards to addressing clinical trials and avoiding Tuskegee and avoiding all the problems that came around Tuskegee. And I've given several talks on that because I've said to people, Tuskegee did not violate any of the 8 principles. One of the principles was, make sure that you are doing the research that will benefit the targeted community. Well, at the time, the target community was the white community, and it was to benefit them. And therefore, if you applied the principle in the way it was written and the way it is written, you were doing it for the benefit of that community. And so you have to really think about what policies you put in place and how they impact individuals. And I think today we still don't, even though we have the IRBs and those sorts of things. They're made up sometimes of people that do not, they may look like the community, but they do not represent the community. And I go back to the major trial that was implemented, I think about 10 years ago, with regards to following disease traits and looking at environmental impact studies with regards to the impact on diseases. And when you look at what came out of it, it said, we're just to observe what happens and describe what happens, and then come up with solutions to what happens. And I'm going, that sounds a lot like Tuskegee to me. Yet nobody picked that up. And when I brought it to their attention, it was like, no. I said, yes. If you look at the strict letter of how you're implementing it, what difference is it to you in terms of Tuskegee? And that comes to me to the idea, in terms of clinical trials, you're going to have to truly involve the community that's impacted. Now, they may not have the degrees that you have, and they may not have gone to the universities or the colleges that you've gone to, but they know the community probably better than you do and can tell you what will work and what will not work.
And on that note, and to follow up, Janka from the FDA had a very similar question. She wanted to know what factors should be addressed for clinical trials and advancing therapies that take into account health disparities.
I think the big issue is trust. We looked at all of the factors that people are putting into place with regards to clinical trials, and one of the big issues that still stands out is the issue of trust. And it breaks down in terms of age, because if you talk to younger people, they may or may not remember Tuskegee, but they do think about whether or not they trust the physician or not. And it may be a handover from their parents or their grandparents that may not be talking about Tuskegee, but the sense of the generational transfer, as I call it, is still there to some extent. And you have to look at how you address that based on age, because if you tell them Tuskegee, they'll look with their eyes glazed over. If you tell somebody over the age of 50, they'll get your attention. But it also goes past persons of color, or actually African Americans. I remember a trial that I was involved with that I was the principal investigator on. And I heard one of my staff, I tell people, if you can't convince a person to be on a clinical trial in 10 minutes or 15 minutes, stop, because you're coercing them in terms of getting them on. This staff person was now at 32 minutes trying to convince this individual. And I just had to walk in. And when I walked in, the person looked at me and said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm the PI of the trial." And they said, "Oh, where do we sign?" It was that instant bond. Yeah. But the unique thing was, it wasn't African American. It wasn't Hispanic American. It was a Vietnamese American who said to me, "I know about Tuskegee." And so the whole sense of that lack of trust, I think, crosses all individuals. And so it's at least at the top of my list in terms of clinical trials.
Okay. And are there publications coming out on that, or?
Now that you mention it, we have one that's coming out, that's already out, actually, in terms of, in the Journal of Clinical Trials. It's called Building Trust and Diversity in Patient-Centered Oncology Clinical Trials. And it's just not clinical trials in terms of oncology. This goes to all trials. But since, my area was in oncology before I retired, that's what we based it on. And if they go to clinical trials, I'll send it to you, Irene, and you can send it out to the individuals who have registered for this. The other is, I think, that people need to know is with regards to the issue of post-traumatic slave syndrome, especially in terms of oppressed people. You don't know how that has impacted us. And I think a lot of the things that we see today in society, the things that are going on in Chicago, the things that are going on in LA, the things that are going on in some large metropolitan cities, including rural America, I think it goes back to post-traumatic slave syndrome or post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is basically the same and becomes inherited intergenerational. And so I'll send you a copy of that paper as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Now, for Amanda, this came in from the chat room to you, actually from Nicole Larond, who is another fellow from 2009. And she wants you to comment on the data sets, genomic and proteomic, that are currently available for use in health disparities research. And also, she wants to know, will this elicit greater interest in personalized medicine? And will this help in data collection as well? So are there systems in place to capture this data? And can you provide us with some explanations or discussions about how this all should happen or work?
So thank you for having me. Thank you for asking this question. I think it's really important because I don't think people know the resources that are currently available. So the National Library of Medicine has databases currently. There's also another database called data.gov that also has, you can select based on different parts of the country, different race categories, ages, and so you can fit the data to what you're trying to look for. They're all publicly available because they are collected by NIH and NSF studies, and so therefore the data has to be available to us as research scientists. But I think you're right. I think once we get to real personalized medication and personalized medicine as a concept, that genetic backgrounds, epigenetics will become the front line of how we evaluate and how we treat an individual. There's a lot of studies currently right now. My research currently is in heart disease or cardiovascular disease in general. And there's a lot of studies now looking at the epigenetic, the environmental and social factors that influence how individuals are affected by the disease, and then the medical implications that it causes, and also how the medicine reacts to the everyday life. So unfortunately, most of us know that most clinical trials are done by individuals who have a great interest in mind. However, the population they end up studying just due because trust in doctors and things like that, the study doesn't represent the people they're going to be treating. So a big push in personalized medicine is making sure that they are treating you and not someone that maybe looks like you.
Right. Very good. Okay, so Russell, this question came in from Margaret from Mayo Clinic College of Medicine and Science. And she says, what do you think of the role genetics plays in the elimination of health disparities?
Well, I mean, I think, considering there are differences, genetic differences, especially amongst racial populations, and of course, the frequencies of various alleles and phenotypes can also vary by racial groups. I really think that, genomics will have an impact on eliminating health disparities. However, I should point out that there are other aspects that should be included as well. I mean, I think Lovell made a great point when he talked about looking at the elephant. And I really think this is just a prime example in which, yes, genomics will play a major role, but we also have to look at other things like social or environmental factors, access to healthcare, nutritional status. So I think all these things together must be applied, and each one in its own point of view are very important. So yeah, I believe that genetics will play an important role, but not genetics alone. It has to be multiple areas from multiple points of view to really ultimately eliminate the health disparities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. No, that's something I think that I want to follow up with Glenn on. And this is actually Glenn coming from Nicholas from Meharry Medical. What are your thoughts on top minority researchers conducting research at HBCUs? So Meharry, Morehouse, Howard, they speak to the reasons that HBCUs with graduate programs seem to not attract the kind of top-level talent in this field, and how can those that are attracted remain at HBCUs? What are some of your thoughts or perspectives on that?
So in regards to that particular point, there's actually an analogous situation to the second part of that question, and it relates to sports. I like talking about things in relation to sports because a lot of people can understand it. And so if we think about the heyday of the Negro League in terms of baseball, that was a point in time where African-American athletes were not able to play in an integrated sports system. And because of that, you had all of the talented players kind of concentrated on these teams of other African-American players. A similar thing happened with the collegiate athletic programs at all of the historically Black colleges and universities. And as soon as there was an opportunity for them to get more resources, to have better access to those resources, then you saw that the old programs that they were once almost exclusively associated with suffered.
Right.
And you can't fault them for it, because if somebody tells you I have bigger and better over here, it's hard to say, no, I'm not going to go over there because I want to stay over here and struggle in some form or fashion. It's just kind of the basic law of economics. So when we talk about the brain drain from our universities, particularly at the graduate level, one of the things that I've seen personally is that you have students who are very bright and everybody wants them. And the fact of the matter is that
where you start determines where you go in this business. So if you start at a university that has less clout, less of prestige associated with it, it will determine your long-term trajectory 99% of the time. And that's been seen countless times. As a matter of fact, in one of the studies that was done in maybe the last 10 years or so, actually within the last 10 years, that was one of the things that was kind of paid attention to in order to determine, well, how are people able to identify whether a person is of a minority background or not? And a lot of times it was the institutions that they were associated with. Even if your name is de-identified, if you have certain scholarships, if you have a certain institution on your bio sketch of your CV, that tends to be a telltale sign. And at this point, I'm sure most of us know certain schools are known for certain things, and that's just one of the biases that comes with the system. So I think it's important for our HBCUs not to have this happen, but it is a system that is very much so dependent upon resources, financial resources. And so if you look at the top funded biomedical research institutions amongst the HBCUs, so that would be Howard, Morehouse, Meharry Medical College, Jackson State, Florida A&M, and I may be missing one. Amongst all of them, I think the one that has the most active R01s at this point in time doesn't have more than 5. And if you compare that to its contemporary amongst all of the universities, another high research activity institution, you're looking at 20 or more. And so if you tell a student that you have an opportunity to work in a place where you have numerous people to work with versus maybe a handful, it's just really that type of issue. So I would say it's important for us to think about how do we get as many resources to stay in place at the HBCUs, because as everyone is suffering, of course, HBCUs are suffering more right now in terms of the finances. Everything that happens on a national scale is magnified at the HBCU in terms of research dollars. So I don't know how it can be changed. I just know that there are some areas that are very important that need to be, the effort needs to be concentrated there. I attended an HBCU, so I remember countless times where I was concerned that we weren't recruiting enough. Mm-hmm. You know, you go to the Abercams, you go to the NCURs, the SACNAS meetings, and you would see many, many major universities recruiting for students, letting them know about the opportunities that were available. And some of the universities may not have needed to be there because their prestige may have preceded them. Well, for smaller universities, it's actually more important to be in those places. But again, that comes down to resources. That comes down to funds, to put people on planes, to put them in cars, to put them in hotels, to put them in front of these students every time there's an event until they start, getting more and more students in. But I do commend our HBCUs that are producing high numbers of graduate students, because they are dedicated to producing more scientists of color so that they can have more say in the types of things that are happening in terms of things like health disparities, because it's important for individuals who are a part of that community, part of that culture, that are vested at that level, to come back and to communicate with their communities and see how they can work to improve situations of health.
I want to add something to that. What you said, Glenn, is completely right, but I think this is a chance for historically Black colleges and universities to shine, because we've been doing it for so long in the sense that we work in a community. So this is where health disparities really works its best. When you take the social scientists, the basic scientists, you take the epidemiologists, you take the nutritionists and put them all together. HBCU has been doing that. We haven't had the resources to have separate. So we've been working together. So this is a time that historically Black colleges can shine. Absolutely. We can show them we've been working like this for the last 25 years, and this is a great material we can show you. So I think we're at that place that if the historic Black colleges and universities want to, we can be the spotlight and the leader in this field right now. Health disparities is what we are, and therefore we do it well.
Well, there is one thing, and maybe Dr. Jones, you can speak to this because you have some experience as well at a much higher level than I've attained at this point. one thing that I've noticed, especially just looking at the number of funded investigators, is that at a lot of HBCUs, you don't tend to see individuals who represent the core mission of the HBCUs, or at least the historical mission of these institutions that are now there doing their research. And I'm not sure if it's a cultural thing, if it's a policy thing, or if it's just like with the students, the opportunities are elsewhere. And so you're unable to recruit investigators that would represent that core demographic. So,
yeah, I think the issue is vision in terms of at the top in the leadership. Having just spent the last 2.5 years at an HBCU, to me, it's a lack of vision. Not that they don't have vision, but in the sciences, it's what you value. And the department I was just in had a site visit, and ironically enough, both of the site visitors were mentees of mine who came in and said, "Oh, you're here?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And when they began to ask about developing and continuing research for the faculty, my first comment to them was, here are all the things that are needed. When I was on a site team a number of years ago coming to that particular institution, there were certain things I asked for and I demanded with regards to the leadership. And those things were absent now. And I have to give credit to those institutions, especially HBCUs, in terms of the products that they are dealing with today. And I'm not talking about level of intelligence. I'm talking about level of preparedness. Mm-hmm. You know, I taught freshman biology, and most of the freshman biology students had not read a book. All of their stuff was online. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so when I asked them to buy a book and utilize that book, you know, about half or 3/4 of the class eyes glazed over. A book? Where's the link? Where's online? You know, I said, no, we're reading a book. And not that book is current, is that getting in the habit of reading and interpreting information, because when you go into science, you're going to pick up a paper and read it, and you're going to have to interpret it. And because it may not be thoroughly accurate, just because it appears in the journal, doesn't mean that it is completely true. The other issue is the time demand to bring those students up so that by the time they are seniors, they can go on to graduate programs and go into medical school and go on to dental school or other professional schools from the time they enter, where they are entering at a deficiency. And it takes about 2 to 3 years to get them to the point where they can compete on the other end. But to compete means that those faculty members, for instance, this particular institution was going to have 1,000 majors coming in and had 9 full-time faculty members. So what does that mean in terms of time? I mean, if you're asking that individual to go into the lab, to be productive, to be successful as a scientist, that means that the students that they would normally take the time to prepare would not get that time. Therefore, you are destroying the seed crop. Just produce a product that is not going to be continuous in terms of continuing to generate individuals that look like you or me, that will have the knowledge. Because I say who you are, and not just who you are, but your life experiences determine the solutions that you look at to implement. And unfortunately, most of the individuals who are in science today, who are investigating this issue of health inequities and health disparities, and even though they may be sincere in terms of their efforts, do not have the life experiences to know that the solutions that they're coming up with maybe exacerbate the problem or don't solve the problem at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've actually had some engagement from overseas. We have two questions from folks from international organizations and universities. This one is to you, Russell. This is Hannah from the Swedish International Development Agency, which I guess operates kind of like our USAID. Why do we continue, she asked, to speak of race? So we're all of the human race. This is kind of philosophical, but I guess it has a genetic underpinning. Can you answer her question?
Well, in my point of view, I think that, health disparities really wants to understand why certain groups suffer from a certain disease or die from a certain disease more than other groups. And yes, their groups can be categorized in many different ways, but I think race is one way in which it can be grouped. When we look at sickle cell, that's something that's in mainly people of African descent, and therefore race becomes an important point of that. Yes, we all are the human race, but there are differences. We're not the same, thank goodness. And I do believe that those differences make us, each individual group unique, and that there could be diseases that affect, or other conditions, disorders that affect one group more so than the other. So I think it's something that it can't be ignored. And again, it's kind of like, well, race is one thing, but I mean, there are other things. Ethnicity is the same way, and there could be disparities there. So I believe that race is just one aspect in which we can divide this in. And so I think that yes, we all are one human race, but we're not all the same. And of course, obviously, some are affected more so than others, and those are in many cases gene driven, and those are things we have to really research.
Yeah, Irene, Russell, I have to correct you on one aspect.
What's that?
Sickle cell anemia is not the law. African Americans do not suffer the largest number in terms of sickle cell. They suffer the largest number in the U.S.
Okay.
But globally, that's not the case. And I think we have to get away from the issue of race as a biological construct. We need to talk about the issue of populations, because when we get more in terms of genomics, we're going to find that the issue falls more in terms of population and shared genetics among populations. For instance, in Laos and Vietnam, in the mountains that connect those two countries, one of the highest incidences of premenopausal breast cancer occurs within those populations within that local region. They aren't Black, but they have one of the highest onsets of premenopausal breast cancer. And if you trace their genomic lineage, it comes to some extent, at least some people speculate, that it comes to an area close to the area of Igunu in Nigeria, where, the crucibles close to it, where everything came out of. And so, we need to begin to focus on how we group people genomically with regards to looking at issues. Because when there was the bowel attack with regards to anthrax in the postal system, one of the first things people thought was, all we need to do is look at all the Blacks in the postal system and come up with a cure or at least an immunization with regards to that. And what they found out was more heterogeneity in population, because Africa is the seat of all the genes. And, they don't segregate just because you're Black in color. And if you look at the populations that came into the U.S., they came in three set groups. The Chesapeake Bay, the Carolina Coast, and the Mississippi Delta. And they were different in terms of culture, different in terms of genomic makeup and background, different. And so when we start, and that's one of the issues I think that leads to us not solving health disparities, because we try to group all African Americans in the same pot. And we don't all fit, we may look alike in terms of certain colors, but we don't all fit in the same pot.
Adding to that is the fact that we let people self-identify. So that goes with people putting themselves in a pot too. So somebody was told by their grandmother that our family's from Tennessee, and so they assume they're of certain descent. And if they were to do genetic testing that is available now, they realize they are much more complex than what they believe themselves to be.
Right.
So that's another issue with health disparities. As we're studying them, we let people self-identify themselves as we're looking in different groups, and that is causing more. Our data is not as pure we'd like it to be. So from a scientific point of view, the governing agents that are funding us see that our results look inconclusive. And it's not that it's inconclusive, it's just another question.
Right. It's like the trait that came from Johns Hopkins. They were all identified as white. And Rick went back and said, there are some people on this tray that have a whole lot of African descent that may on yours, you like to say they're white, but, and when they went back to look at that, yep, they may have been on their birth certificate white, but the genomic makeup said, they fell under the one drop rule.
So on that note, actually, and to follow up on what Hannah from Sweden was asking, we have one last question. This is for everybody, and then we're going to wrap up with a comment from each of you. But this question comes from the University of Lagos, and it's from Sylvester, who would like to know if there are differences in the symptoms associated with viral infections based on race. So that's to the field. That's to the panel. Anybody?
Well, I think I go back to what I opened with, and that is, I can't talk about the biology of viruses and how they impact, because you get into epigenetic factors that influence how they're absorbed and their risk. But I go back to the whole issue of infectious diseases. You could have been on the forest reaches of a reservation. Somebody was going to make sure they were after you with a needle to immunize you, because they never knew when you would come off that reservation and be infectious to someone else. And so your sense of caring about people, maybe you didn't like them, maybe you discriminated against them, and a whole list of other things. But you made sure. I mean, I remember in the Black community where I grew up in Louisiana, there was an immunization station that made sure that every kid in my school was immunized. You look at the city of Houston now, and you look at the number of kids that are unimmunized, and you go, my God, we're in we're in a port city that has this number. That's, again, because we're now in a chronic disease model. And being in a chronic disease model, public health takes a back seat. And so, people don't worry when we cut public health departments and we cut immunization programs and we cut this, because they're in the mindset that your health does not impact me. Therefore, why should I be concerned about you being immunized? And I'm going, that's the problem.
Right. Okay, so unfortunately, we're almost out of time. This has been fascinating. This has been very enlightening. We've gotten a lot of comments and questions and tweets from the community about this discussion. And so why don't we then, I guess, start with Glenn, and then Amanda, then Russell, and then we'll end with Lovell. Glenn, 1 minute with respect to what your thoughts and perspectives are on the field of health disparities research.
So overall, I think health disparities research, again, has to become a communal process. There can't be overt disconnects between scientists in different fields, and the community has to be an integrated part in that entire process, because if you don't have community stakeholders, you really aren't doing anything of any real merit. It's just you're playing with your toys in the lab, essentially. Another thing, and I've been going kind of in and out of the chat room myself, is that we have to, again, just understand when we're saying health disparities, what we're talking about. We're not just talking about the idea of socially determined disparities. We're not just talking about the biologically determined disparities. We're talking about everything all wrapped up. And that's why it has to be this dynamic conversation that's constantly evolving as we understand that things like race are essentially misnomers of other things or surrogates for other things. But as Dr. Jones had stated, we're talking about populations because we know that genetically, if you isolate individuals long enough, that things will change over time. And then when you put them back together, now the problems that population may not have had will become more evident because they're exposed to new stimuli, to new experiences. And there's few things that are more evident than the types of diseases that we're seeing more and more nowadays in terms of the cancer, the hypertension, cardiovascular disease across the board. So I think our conversation just needs to constantly evolve, and we need to keep having these discussions, bring in more investigators on all sides from different backgrounds, scientifically and culturally, so that this can continue to be productive.
Thank you. Amanda?
So I have two major things I want to speak on. The first one being that the word health disparities to me makes it seem like a disconnect from the general healthcare system, and it shouldn't be. Health disparities is integrated into our everyday life, our everyday health system. So separating the two is not a profound way to think of it because it becomes someone else's problem a lot of times when you pull it apart. Like, geneticists don't think it's theirs, or they do to some extent, but not the same way that the public health individuals do. So making sure it's part of the concept of healthcare in general to us. And then the other thing about health disparities is this is our time as a nation to really embrace who we are. So you study what's important to you and what's affecting the people around you. There hasn't been a time in our society that we've really had this opportunity that my family is affected by these diseases and these influences and this epigenetic factors now that I can say that as a seasoned scientist, and I can now study them. And I can study them with the knowledge and the understanding what that really means because I am in the community. So we're at that place that we can study these comprehensively, and we need to not think about them in one silo or one situation. It's healthcare and the healthcare of our nation.
Thank you. And Russell.
Okay, so I guess my feelings on health disparities, I am not a health disparity expert. I'm a basic scientist. And I really believe that what we need now to really focus people like me on this we need to have a population of scientists, of faculty, of people that are actually writing grants, doing research, that are caring about the research they're doing. You're going to do something that you care about. Therefore, we need more people of color in faculty positions that are doing research. And I think that's to me is one aspect that may actually increase interest in health disparities. Getting someone like me to be involved in health disparities. So I really believe that now is a time that we need to. We've done a great job in the last several years increasing underrepresented students, postdocs, and I think we're stuck at that, getting over that hill to the faculty positions, and I think that would really kind of help, populate, say, for example, HBCUs, doing research, teaching kids, look, you can come back here and start doing research and build a big community. So I really believe that, at least from my point of view, I think that's a step that we really need to take to increase interest in health disparities.
Yes, thank you. And Lovell, you get the last word. You get 1 minute for the last part.
Wow. I want to thank you, Irene, for organizing this and bringing us all together. One of the things that my mentor said to me that I try to espouse and give to my mentees and anyone I come across, it's not the papers you publish, it's not the grants you get, it's not the honors bestowed on you, but it is the people you train and mentor that you leave to carry on the work. That's your greatest contribution to science. The other stuff will come along with it. Health by itself will not solve the issue of health. We've tried that for many, many decades, and it hasn't worked, and especially it's not going to work with regards to the diverse populations we're looking at. And I have to echo the idea that we're going to have to bring in multiple individuals involved in this: urban planners, health policy people, health communication people, genomicists, you name the group. They're going to all have to sit at the table because it all has a bearing in terms of how we address health and the health of this nation. The final thing I would say that we need, the message that we need to get across to everyone, white, Black, Hispanic, Asian American, Latino, gay, straight, you name it, that the issue of public health, because we've forgotten public health in public health, that public health inequities, and I say inequities, and I think we need to change the term from health disparities to health equity, to move towards a positive as opposed to always talking about a negative, to have a vision of positive as opposed to a vision of negative. And the word equity is important because when we talk about equal, we can all be equal. That looks like, to me, the picture of the kids looking over a 10-foot fence and you give them all the same box, but some are shorter than the others and they're all equal, but they can't look over the fence. You made them equal. The whole idea of equity is bringing everybody's health to the same level, and that will benefit everyone. And so my closing is the theme of the workshop and the theme that we will put forth. That is, health disparities and inequities make us all sick, and we need to be aware of that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. I want to thank the panel. I want to thank all of the people who joined us live and who continue to join us for this discussion. So thank you for joining us on this virtual Keystone Symposia e-panel event, and a recording of this will be available on this site. For additional information on Keystone Symposia, please visit us at www.keystonesymposia.org. Thank you again.